Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next webinar in our series, Bringing Data to Life. My name is Eleanor, and I work at the Office for National Statistics. We're delighted to see so many of you join us today for our beginners webinar on the misuse of statistics. Before we start, we'd like to remind you all that the webinars in this series will be recorded and will be available on YouTube after the event. The slides and recordings for our previous webinars are now available on the ONS website. Everyone signed up to this webinar will receive a link once today's recording is available. If you are using the Teams app and you would like to turn on the live captions for this webinar, please click on the More button across the top of your screen. For those who haven't used this before, it's the button with 3 dots to the left of your camera button. Once you've clicked More, scroll down to Languages and Speech, and then you can select the option to show live captions. With so many of you joining us today, the chat function is closed and all questions will be facilitated through Slido. I'll cover this in more detail in just a moment. This webinar series is for everyone, so please share the recording and slides when they're available and join the conversation on socials using the hashtag #StatisticsForThePublicGood. Lastly, you will be invited to complete a short survey at the end of the webinar, and we'd really welcome your feedback on the webinar series and the statistics we produce. If you're interested in other topics in our series, we have a wellbeing statistics webinar coming up in March, or perhaps you're interested in crime statistics, which we'll host in April. We'll be adding more webinars to the collection in April, and they'll be hosted over the summer period. You can sign up to the next webinars by going onto the Bringing Data to Life collection on Eventbrite or scanning the QR code on the screen at the moment. I'll just give you a few seconds to scan it if you'd like. Lovely. The session today is interactive with some questions for you, and there will be around a 15 to 20-minute Q&A section after the presentations. Please join in by scanning the QR code on your screen or heading over to slido.com and using the number 3232098. If you're using the desktop Microsoft Teams app, you can click on the Slido button at the top of your screen and Slido will appear that way as well. And don't worry if the Slido code, you miss it, it will appear at the footer of every slide, so you'll have it on your screen. I'm so pleased to welcome our speakers today. We're joined by Nikki Pierce, Head of Casework, and Anna Price, Lead Statistics Regulator at the Office for Statistics Regulation, OSR. Nikki and Anna will explain who OSR are, what they do, and get you thinking about some cases of statistical misuse. From ONS, we're joined by Miles Fletcher, Head of Media, who will explain how we manage misinformation on different platforms and how we create digital content for various users. I would now like to hand over to Nikki and Anna.
Hi there, everyone. Just checking that you can hear me and see me.
Yep, we can hear you and see you, Nikki.
Great, thank you. My team has had a little bit of a freak out then, which is exactly what you want just before you present. Great, thank you for having us here today, everyone. So yes, my name is Nikki. I'm the Head of Casework at the Office for Statistics Regulation. Don't worry, I'll be explaining both what casework is and what the Office for Statistics Regulation is as well as part of this presentation. And also today I have my colleague Anna Price with me, who heads up our health and social care domain as well. Great. So one thing we spend a lot of time thinking about at OSR is how we build trust and maintain trust in the government, especially in relation to statistics. So what we're going to do is start with a couple of questions on trust, and you can see the first question on the screen now. So the first question is, what percentage of the public do you think would generally trust politicians to tell the truth? So I'll give you a second there to answer that question. Looks like we've got the majority coming in at about 12%. Some very optimistic people at 69%, but definitely in the minority. So I'll just give you another minute or so on that one. Okay, great. So I think we ended up there with about 12% and 9% almost neck and neck. So then we have a follow-up question here, which is what percentage of the public would generally trust civil servants to tell the truth? Okay, so most common is about 43%. It's good. We've still got the minority down at 11%, but a slightly larger minority. So I think those people maybe don't have a lot of faith in the trust and the civil service. But yeah, I can see most of the results there coming in around 43%. Great. And what you've got here is the results from the Ipsos Veracity Index. So this is actually one big graph. We've just chopped off the bottom and put it side by side so it's easier for you to read. So what you can see is you've got politicians right down at the bottom there with only 9% of the public saying that they would generally trust them to tell the truth. Civil servants do fare a little bit better with 51% of the public saying that they would generally trust them to tell the truth. But even with that 51%, there's still plenty of room for improvement. So these results are from 2023, and they actually showed that trust in politicians had reached its lowest score in 40 years. And there's a couple of other indices that we can use to look at trust in government and trust in statistics as well. So there's another survey called the Public Confidence in Official Statistics Survey, which is conducted by NatCen, the Centre for Social Research. And that survey found in 2021 that 87% of respondents trust statistics produced by the Office for National Statistics, which is very good. And 74% of people agreed that ONS statistics were produced free from political interference, which is actually a requirement for statistics produced by government. However, the proportion of people who agree that the government presents statistics honestly remains low at 35%. So, you know, the ONS on its own is kind of faring well, but generally across government, maybe the trust in statistics and politicians more generally is quite low. So one thing that we do a lot of at OSR is really thinking about how we can promote ways of working that will build trust in government and through building trust and confidence in how it produces and uses evidence and statistics. And one of the big things that we do is call out behaviours or use of evidence that could be detrimental to public confidence and trust. So when a politician has maybe said something that wasn't quite accurate, that is something that we will look into. And I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. So the next slide then. So I've mentioned OSR a couple of times. So some of you might be thinking, who are you? And no worries if you haven't heard of us. We are very small, but I like to think somewhat mighty. So hopefully by the end of the day, you'll have a better understanding of who we are and what we do. Put simply, we are what's called the regulatory arm of the UK Statistics Authority. So hopefully the majority of you, given that you're at an ONS event, have probably heard of the ONS. So we sit alongside the ONS, both under the UK Statistics Authority umbrella. So we don't produce statistics, we don't handle any data, and we are completely separate from the Office for National Statistics. And what we do is regulate statistics across the whole of the UK. So that also includes the devolved nations of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland as well. And we promote and safeguard the production and publication of official statistics. And official statistics are basically just statistics produced by government. And there's a few different ways that we do that. We have a code of practice and we do sort of reviews of statistical outputs. And then we also do what is called casework as well, which I'll come on to. So if we move to the next slide. So we have one really clear vision in the OSR, and that vision is that statistics should serve the public good. And everything we do is driven by this vision, and the judgments that we make and the decisions that we make are determined by what is in the best public interest and what is in the public good. And this is a really broad definition, and we've actually done a lot of work ourselves on what does the public good actually mean. And if you're interested in that, you can have a look on our website at some of the publications we've put out on that. But today's presentation, we are focusing on one specific aspect of the public good, which is, if we move to the next slide, that statistics are part of the lifeblood of democratic debate. So obviously that sounds very grand, but what does that actually mean? What that means is we think it's not possible to have, you know, a fair and equal democracy without that foundation of good statistics. If you don't have good statistics, you can't have informed debate, you can't figure out what the issues are, you can't work out what effective solutions to those issues are going to be, and you can't even have, you know, sensible, informed discussions about anything. So statistics are really that kind of bedrock of a good democracy. And what OSR does is we protect the role of statistics in public debate by combating the misleading use of evidence by government. And we do this by something I've already mentioned, which is called casework. And casework is basically when we investigate an issue that has been raised with us of a potential misuse of statistic or an issue with a statistic. And anyone is allowed to raise casework with us. It can be members of the public, it can be MPs, journalists, academics, even yourselves on the call today. And we investigate any concern exactly the same, regardless of who it has been raised by. And the topics that are covered by the casework that is raised with us can be very varied. We have specific teams for different topic areas. As I mentioned, Anna leads our health and social care team. We also have teams, economic statistics, children education, and so on. But typically, the concerns raised with us tend to relate to how statistics have been used or how they have been produced. And on average, we investigate somewhere between 200 and 300 cases a year. And I always describe our casework as being like an iceberg. You have underneath the surface, there's a huge amount of work that goes into us investigating cases, working with other government departments to understand what's happened, gather information, build good working relationships with them so we can help embed better working practices across government, also talking to the complainants as well. And a lot of the cases that we have will respond to privately, which basically means that we won't do a sort of public intervention on it. Normally, these are cases where we don't consider there to be a big issue at hand, and we've managed to reach a positive resolution kind of behind the scenes. But every now and then, there will be really key cases that we think have got a real public interest to them, where we will respond and intervene publicly. And this will be by writing letters, often to senior leaders across government. And when these cases happen, they often pick up quite a lot of media attention, and we're going to give you some examples in a minute. So on our website, if you're interested, you can find the links to how to raise a concern with us. You can find out more about our casework. You can read some of the public interventions that we've done. So there's some of the letters that we've sent. We also have an annual casework report, and there's also a weekly log. So if you want to see the types of things that get raised with us, as I say, this log gets updated every single week, and you can see the whole tranche of data of what's been raised with us previously and how we've responded to those. So that's a quick overview of our casework function. So what we're going to do now is talk you through some examples of the type of cases that might get raised with us and that we might look into, and why these are so important for trust and for democratic debate. So the first one here, as you can see on the screen, we've got one question. Don't worry, it's not a GCSE maths test, but we're just interested to see if anyone can say what they think is wrong with this chart. So this is an actual chart that was published by the Treasury. It went out on Twitter back in 2023. So yeah, I'll just give everyone a minute to see how much of their maths they can remember. Yeah, and we've gone straight in at the correct answer in the middle there. And I think most of the other ones are variation on the same answer. So I think, yeah, that's really great that a lot of you picked up on that. So if we move, great, we've got the next slide. So what you can see here is that the graph has what we call a truncated axis, which is the technical term for it, which basically means that the axis doesn't start at 0. And the reason why this is really important is if you looked at that graph on the left, so the one from the Treasury, if you just happen to see that on Twitter, maybe the writing is quite small, you're not stopping to look at what the axes are. You might look at that and think, oh, inflation, that's gone down by maybe a quarter, maybe a third, a rough guess from the sort of first and fourth bars there. You might think to yourself, oh, that's quite a lot. It's really good. Inflation's gone down that much. Whoever's in charge is clearly making the right decisions. But what you can see on the right-hand side is the exact same figures presented in a graph where the axis starts at 0. And if you looked at that, you might think, oh, inflation, that's gone down maybe a tenth. That's a little bit, but there's clearly still a long way to go. So you can see just the importance. There's nothing wrong with the one on the left in terms of the accuracy of the figures. The data is all correct. Some people might argue, well, that's not misleading, but we can see even subtle ways in the way data is presented can lead people to the wrong conclusion and can kind of undermine that trust. So as I said, the first chart was published by the Treasury, and that went out on Twitter in February 2023. And we investigated this concern that was raised with us by someone, and we judged that it was misleading. And we wrote publicly to the Treasury on this instance, and you can find that letter on our website. So what I'm going to do now is pass you to Anna, who's going to talk through a slightly more complicated piece of casework that we've handled.
Thank you very much, Nikki. So yeah, we're going to move on to another example of a typical case that we might receive. And this was a real claim made by Boris Johnson in February 2022 that there were 420,000 more people in employment than before the pandemic began. So over the next few minutes, we're going to investigate this case together, the way that we would in OSR if we received a concern about this claim, and see what you all make of it. So the first thing that we would do when we receive a concern is have a look at the underlying data. So you can see here, we're looking at employment figures published by the ONS, and these were the figures that were available at the time in February 2022. Now, this might look like quite a complicated graph at first glance, so I'll just talk you through it while you make your mind up about whether the claim made by Boris Johnson was misleading or not. So the graph shows the change in employment levels over time compared to December 2019 to February 2020. And we're looking at employment for three different categories shown in the different shades of blue. So we've got full-time employees, part-time employees, and the self-employed. Running horizontally, we've got 3-month periods of time, and running vertically, we've got the change in employment in thousands. So either increasing or decreasing, depending whether the number is above or below the zero line. So a figure above zero means an increase in employment, a figure below zero means a decrease. And you can also see a green line going across the graph, and that shows the total employment. So if the green line is above zero, that means there's more employment than in late 2019, early 2020. If it's below zero, then there's less. So having looked at the data, the question that we have for you is whether you think employment has gone up or down since 2020. I'll give you a few minutes to have a think about that and pop your answer in. You can say that you think employment went down, that you think it went up, or that you're unsure, which is equally valid answer. So I can see straight away lots of you have answered that you think employment has gone down. Quite a few people unsure, which I think is fair, and we'll come on to in a minute the sort of nuance within this example, and a few votes for up, but a pretty clear vote for thinking that employment has gone down. So as I said, fair enough if you weren't quite sure, because actually there is a bit of nuance to the data. And what the data showed, you can see in red highlighted here, the data for that period in time, February 2022, that Boris Johnson made this claim. And what the data showed was that there were more people in full-time employment at that point in time than before the pandemic. But total employment was actually lower than before the pandemic began. And that was because the number of people in part-time employment and the number of people who were self-employed had both gone down more than the number of people in full-time employment had gone up. So a couple more questions that I've got for you at this point, having heard the claim, looked at the data and seen what it showed. And what I'm going to get you to do is use the hands up function at this point. So I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you think what Boris Johnson said was misleading. A pretty quick vote for a lot of you thinking it's misleading. Great, thank you. And then what I'm going to ask you to do next, if you think it was misleading, if you were the regulator leading on this case, would you suggest that we write publicly to Boris Johnson about this issue? So if you think that we should write publicly, you can keep your hand raised. If you think not, you can put your hand back down again. So it looks to me like about the same amount of people who thought the claim was misleading thought we should also write to Boris Johnson about it. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see that is indeed what we did. We considered that the claim was misleading. The claim made wasn't supported by the kind of full picture of the underlying data. So we wrote publicly both to the head of data science at number 10, whose team was responsible for briefing the Prime Minister about these figures, and also to the Prime Minister himself. And you can see on the screen here some examples of the press coverage that followed our intervention. So the issue that at the heart of this case was that the selective use of data without a very clear caveat about which data were being included and which data were being excluded gave a misleading impression of the overall trends in employment. And being clear about caveats which impact the appropriate interpretation of statistics is one of the key ways to combat misuse of statistics and protect their role in public debate. And it leads us on nicely to a concept that we call at OSR intelligent transparency. Intelligent transparency is about taking an open, clear, and accessible approach to the publication of statistics to support public understanding of and confidence in numbers used by governments. And at OSR, we want to see intelligent transparency be the default approach to communicating all data, statistics, and other types of analysis by government. Now, there's quite a lot of words on this slide, but what intelligent transparency boils down to is three things, and we've touched on one of these in the last example already. So the first is that people in government should not make numerical claims that can't be backed up by data that's publicly available to everyone at the same time. So where a number is used in the public domain, in an output published by the government, in a speech in the House of Commons, wherever that may be, that data should be available to everybody in advance or at the same time that the statement's made. Secondly, people in government shouldn't use statistics in a misleading way. So like in the employment figure example, if there's any important context, any caveats or limitations which impact the appropriate interpretation of the underlying figures, those must be communicated clearly alongside the figures. And then finally, the production and publication of official statistics must be free from political influence and independent of policy processes. And this really supports the trustworthiness of official statistics. And there are lots of mechanisms in place to protect this through our Code of Practice for Statistics. To finish up, I thought I would share with you some questions that we ask ourselves when we look at a case, like the graph that Nikki shared or the employment claim. These are questions that we ask ourselves when we're investigating a case, but they're also questions that you, as a user of statistics, could ask yourself too if you're trying to decide whether you have any concerns over a figure that you're seeing used in the public domain by governments. So the first question is there a source for the figure? And if so, does that figure come from a reputable, reliable, trustworthy source? Can you access the underlying information behind that number? So this really fits with the first principle of intelligent transparency about equality of access. Are you able to see the analysis and check that you agree with the way that it's being presented? And then finally, is the figure presented in the right context? So are there any really important limitations or caveats which impact how the figures can be used? And if so, are these communicated clearly? At OSR, we're really passionate about protecting the role of statistics in public debate. I hope that the examples that we've given you and the questions that you can ask yourself have given you a few tools to help you scrutinise the numbers presented by government. But as Nikki said, you're also welcome to raise concerns with us about how governments across the UK are communicating statistics through our casework function. I'm going to hand over to Miles now and really look forward to the Q&A at the end of the session.
Thanks, Anna. Yes, my name is Miles Fletcher. I'm head of media for the Office for National Statistics. And once again, if you're interested enough in stats to be on this seminar, I think we could probably assume that you've got a fair idea of who we are, but just for the record, we are the National Statistical Institute of the UK, and that means we produce the official stats that are deemed to be the most important and all the key topics affecting the economy and population, inflation, economic growth, GDP, jobs, employment, crime. We run the census in England and Wales. Birth, marriages, and deaths, and very topically these last few years, migration, of course, and that adds up to an awful lot of attention that we get both in public debate and in the media, and that's what I'm here to talk about. But central to everything we do, and just echoing what we heard from our colleagues in the OSR just now, central to what we do is the mission to serve the public good. And specifically, do we have a duty to inform the public on social and economic issues? It's all very well just to produce statistics, Parliament said to us when they laid this down in legislation, but people have got to be able to access them and to hear them, informing public debate and being challenged, interrogated, and most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, being communicated as well, that they're out there living and being used. And that's central to what me and my small team get up to. As you can see here, we front up in the media because the media is the main way that most people do access our statistics. Traditional media, print and broadcast news, but also, of course, increasingly digital and social media, more on which we'll be hearing in a minute. So, as I say, as well as publishing the stats on the website, we're out there talking about them. We offer comments from named statisticians, for example, if you read accounts online, or if you're still reading printed newspapers, you'll see an ONS statistician quoted quite often. We started doing that a few years back because we discovered that by offering a named quote, it gave us more prominence. It gave our voice greater impact in the coverage, and that meant we could explain the significance more effectively of our latest statistical releases, and other voices, sometimes perhaps an inclination to spin things or to sensationalize them, we're taking the lead on that. So we sort of rested a degree of control back. And if you're an early riser, you'll see and hear our people at shortly after 7 o'clock in the morning, when we release several times a month our big economic data like inflation and GDP. During the pandemic, you'll have seen senior statisticians explaining what was going on over the course of the virus. We ran the big COVID infection survey back then. And so we do everything we can to get on whatever programs and whatever media channels we can, and to be really upfront and talking about the numbers. And and this is how we really get out and make sure that these numbers not only reaching people but are properly understood. To give a recent example, the stat like GDP is much debated. Is the economy growing or is it shrinking? And in a strictly non-partisan way, I've got to say I've had huge sympathy for recent chancellors who've had to deal with great sensationalist headlines about whether there's a plus sign or a minus sign. Really, colleagues, the difference between growth of 0.1% reported in the monthly GDP figures and a contraction of 0.1% isn't that great. What we're really talking about here is a lack of growth, or limited growth. It certainly isn't the difference between political triumph and political disaster, as some of the media would often portray it. And we've done a lot to try and get out there and give that context, not least because we're acutely aware of the fact that we could revise GDP and change the story completely. It's just an example of something we've put a lot of time and effort into explaining through all the channels that are available to us. But as well as getting out there and influencing news coverage on the day, we're here to help journalists and members of the public with their statistical queries. We take several thousand questions from the media every year, a whole range of topics, most of them very, very sensible and pertinent questions. Occasionally a couple of daft ones. We were asked the other day how many children of potato eating age there were in the country, something we didn't quite understand. Somebody interestingly asked us how many ice cream vans were left in the country. That's more interesting. We couldn't actually come up with an answer for that, but generally we are able to answer people's people's questions. And as I say, we were really proud of being open in that way. If you look at the ONS website on Contact Us, you'll find a whole range of ways of getting directly in touch with the ONS. And so that's not just for journalists, that's for everybody. To ask the people who produce the statistics questions about what they produce, what is available. Sometimes perhaps they'll point you to other organizations who can help you. And it's all part of this, regulated statistical environment that you heard about from my very able colleagues there in OSR. Intelligent transparency is very, very, very important, and something I think, about to say this. Obviously, I'm completely biased, but I think it's something that we, should be appreciative of this in this country, and a lot of us certainly do our very best to make sure that works as a system. But of course, you don't need me to tell you that statistics are not always accurately reported, particularly in the nether regions of digital and social media. So what do we do then? Well, we spend a lot of time monitoring the media. Every morning, and throughout the day, we're constantly seeing how statistics are being reported. For example, just to plug today's coverage, the national news media, just to pluck a few examples, that there was coverage of ONS stats on how many overseas students are in graduate level jobs, how many people vape, how much trade do we do with India, scores of mentions, and that's just in a typical day. Among those, and this is also fairly typical, there was just one inaccuracy. A national news outlet attributed to us a claim that most universities are heading for financial deficit, which might be true, except we didn't actually say it. It was the Office for Students. I guess it was a case of people getting their offices for mixed up. But anyway, the point is we contacted the paper, and they very quickly corrected it. And this is, generally, as far as the mainstream media are concerned, the news media we have in this country, they are quick to, when you point out inaccuracy to them, they are invariably happy to correct the record. And we don't do that publicly. We're not in the business of publicly confronting either journalists or anybody else. And we find this approach overall effective. And I think it comes back to the point that we've heard already from our colleagues in the regulator. The question you always ask is, do you trust the source? Do you trust the ONS? Do you trust the mainstream news organizations, which generally they're regulated, to some degree? They value the trust of their audiences, their listeners, and their readers, and by and large they are willing to correct inaccuracy and misinformation. And that's not to say, of course, they won't spin things or take a view on statistics that we're all going to agree with and sign up to. But our job as the ONS, operating in a strictly impartial way, is to explain what the facts actually say, what they can be trusted for and not trusted to say, not to be over relied on in that sort of way as well. So sometimes, however, sadly, we can't just operate behind the scenes. And during the pandemic, we had a couple of instances, which I'm going to talk you through now, where there was misinformation getting into circulation that did genuinely pose, it's not too sensational to say, I think, did genuinely pose a real risk and needed to be really overtly challenged and dealt with. And this is how we went about it. The first claim, just on the left-hand side of the screen there, this was put about by a website that was much given to sort of conspiracy theories about COVID, but nevertheless had something of a following on social media, regrettably. And this claim, this official data shows children are up to 52 times more likely to die following COVID-19 vaccination than unvaccinated children, and the ONS is trying to hide it, it claimed. This couldn't be taken. We couldn't let this go by any means. Yes, we did put out some data that appeared to suggest this, but what this website did was miss out the most important context. And the context was that, as most of you will probably recall, children generally were not vaccinated during the pandemic. It was only those with particular health vulnerabilities that were. And that's why those numbers, those tragic numbers there were, really, you couldn't compare that that group of vaccinated children with the unvaccinated children with any degree of relevance or accuracy. So what did we do? Well, we got a press release, blogs, social content. We hit the airwaves. We got out and we told the story, and that resulted in coverage from again the BBC. A lot of the fact checkers picked up on it. It was all across our social channels. Now, again, you know, I wouldn't claim that people weren't misinformed, but we were at least doing our bit to make sure that accurate information was available for anyone who cared to look for it. And another example we had on the right-hand side in similar vein there, the ONS stated black and white that just 17,000 people have died of COVID-19 in the past 2 years. Well, again, this was highly misleading, but it was used to advance the case that all the restrictions that took place during the pandemic were unnecessary because only, and I stress the inverted commas here, which is still of course a lot of people, that only 17,000 people had died rather than 150,000, which was the official total of people who had died as a result of COVID at that time. What was misleading about it was because the people who put this claim about, again, ignored the full context of it, that the 17,000 people are those who died without any other health condition noted on the death certificate. Now, the sort of condition that could be noted on the death certificate were conditions like asthma or high blood pressure. Conditions, in other words, that if properly managed, certainly wouldn't necessarily mean that those people were going to die, and that the doctors who had certified those deaths had listed COVID as a cause of death. So it was highly misleading to claim that only 17,000 people had died directly as a result of COVID. And I'm afraid this did have quite a bit of pickup. We had some quite prominent political figures reporting it because they'd read it somewhere. And again, we had to get active, get out there, press statements, interviews, social content to slay that one. So that's how we've gone about doing it in those situations. It's just trying to make sure, and again, I must stress the fact that we don't think that any of this is a silver bullet for misinformation, and anyone who ventures into social media can see that there's plenty of that. But I just want to give an illustration of where necessary we will get active and get vocal in challenging misinformation. Similarly, as you see on the slide here, we do this with social media by constant monitoring, identifying what is potentially misleading and what has the real what has the threat of doing real damage, bringing in expert colleagues, some of whom are out there posting on social media themselves and providing expert guidance. Sometimes taking on the conspiracy theorists out there on social media channels and being supported from us to do that. And again, depending on the individual or the organisation sharing the context, on the codes of practice they might be operating under, we'll contact them directly. And this goes particularly for public figures, people with real prominence, and we'll help them to see it from the correct statistical point of view. And again, having said all this, I'm acutely conscious that the ONS as an organisation, we're tolerant of particularly media journalists, when they get things wrong, because sometimes we get things wrong too. We issue corrections, much as the media do. We revise statistics sometimes because new and better information is available. Sometimes because perhaps there has actually been an error. We've been supplied some information. But the important thing I would say is that people trust us as an organisation, trust the regulators. That when misinformation does become apparent, that we will try and act to do something about it. There's a well-known news organisation whose unofficial motto is "Never wrong for long." Well, that's in this very fast-moving world of digital media. That's not a bad idea. It's not a bad principle. We try to get things right first time, obviously, but we've always got to be ready to correct and do our very best. So we've heard a lot there, therefore, about trusting sources, finding trustworthy sources of information, not being, falling into the misinformation abyss. So back to you now, audience. Here's the next challenge on Slido. Where would you look for statistics, data, or information published by the ONS? Where do you go? Where do you go first? Okay, website. Good. That's www.gov.uk for those few people who are perhaps not aware of it. Google search coming up there. I say, which I should say is actually is a pretty good way of finding it. And that will take you to the right bit of the ONS website. No miss. We've got some expert users here, clearly. A whole bunch of sources. Now, I think this makes quite an important point. The website is. We've worked hard to make it more accessible for people. We're making redoubling our efforts, and those who use it regularly will begin to see some quite important changes, I trust, over the next couple of years, as we bring in a new content management system and change the way we present things fundamentally. But I'm going to spend a little time there, having seen that. That multiplicity of suggestions that people provided apart from the website, there's quite an important truth in there. It means we have to operate through, if not the website, means we have to operate through a lot of channels, a lot of different, and reach a lot of different audiences in different ways, and in using different styles as well. So let me just explain our approach to the website anyway at the moment. And basically, as you see on the left-hand side here, we see essentially there are 6 different types of statistical user that we deal with, or we cater for, I should say. We try and present things. At one end of the scale, you've got the technical user, the analyst, the high-powered numbers person sitting perhaps in a research institution, in a government department, and doesn't want to hear ONS's take on the numbers. The numbers speak loudly for themselves. Thank you very much. Give me the data set and I will decide for myself what's important about it. That's absolutely fine. That's an important audience that we serve. Sitting in the middle, there are people who are perhaps maybe less analytically inclined, but want to come up with get a really cogent view of what's going on a particular topic. And they could be professionals like policy influencers, they're called, perhaps people in think tanks, for example, perhaps in campaigns, and perhaps people supporting MPs and politicians. And then there's the people I like to think is our people in the media team. There's the inquiring citizens, people perhaps maybe like yourselves who come along to a seminar or venture onto the ONS website and try and find information. And then also there's the passive citizens who are here to serve. And I started this bit of the talk by explaining how we have that duty to go out and inform the public. Well, the passive citizens who experience stats through the news media or through social media, they're very much in our sights as well as people we want to inform. So as far as the website is concerned, this is how we break down the content here. Left-hand side, the data, pure data. This is for our technical users, our expert analysts. This is the hardcore brigade. Simple data sets, data series provided in fairly dried form, and we're trying to present those in more flexible and ways, bring in APIs and so forth. For those who are familiar with that technology, expect to see, I trust, some progress over that over the next few years. For those, the influencers and the information foreigners, we provide commentary on bulletins. This is what I was talking about earlier about, when we provide stats comments. We provide succinct main points, which seek to explain in straightforward terms what's new, what's up, what's down, what's different, what is the significance of this particular statistical release, and what's latest. And then, and this is a development of recent years, and this is what's really been enabled by digital technology, and again, an area which we're particularly interested in developing in, is allowing people to explore their own areas, to explain particular geographies in this graphically rich kind of way, to interrogate what's going on in their own data, and really experience the richness of ONS data right down to very, very local level in many cases. And then finally, we're committed also to what we call data journalism, which is why we produce full-blown articles that are data rich, visually rich, but explain topics again to inquiring citizens primarily in a way that a news organisation would, but one but actually that draws fully on the resources and expertise of the ONS. So all of that is there to be discovered if you haven't discovered it already. And again, if you can't find it, to contact us. We don't just rely on the website. We use external channels as well. I'd invite you to, whatever social media platforms you use, and we are on all of the major ones. You'll find rich content, including videos and explainers. Video is something we've invested in quite a bit over the last few years, producing these explanatory guides, but also occasionally videos on big statistical releases like migration and GDP and inflation when they come out as well. We have a statistician doing a short explanation of what's going on. This again is very important to us in reaching audiences, in reaching diverse audiences in different ways through the channels that they use. And we've gone beyond that again in recent years, producing podcasts. Eleanor, if we go on to thank you. Go on to the next slide. We've produced a series of podcasts explaining all the major topics, the major subjects that ONS covers, and looking at big issues like AI, for example, data ethics. So if you have more than a passing interest in statistics, do please have a rummage around in the archive of podcasts, and we hope to be doing a few more of those this year as well. We produced a book to set the scene for the census, and the paperback edition of the book was updated with that. And we do a blog as well that's available on the website, which is sort of news and updates, and explains how we do what we do. And all of that is there. So we've sometimes been taken to task for doing too much of these things, but at a time when media is changing very rapidly, people's consumption changing rapidly, we've learned a lot by getting out there and supporting our statistics as actively as we can through communications. And I hope you found that interesting. And shall we move to taking a few questions?
Lovely. Thank you so much, Miles, Nikki and Anna. Great presentations. And thank you so much to everyone for taking part in the Slido interactions. There's some really good answers coming through. We're now going to move on to the question section for the rest of the event. And we've had lots of great questions coming through on Slido. We will be answering the most popular questions first. So please do give a thumbs up to any of those questions. I can see we've got some really popular ones. If we don't have time to get to your question today, the ONS Engagement Hub inbox is always open, so please get in touch with us through engagement.hub@ons.gov.uk, or if you would like to get in touch with OSR, you can contact regulation@statistics.gov.uk. So let's have a look at some of these questions that are coming through. All right, so the first one is from Martin. Thank you. Do you actually have any legal sanctioning powers for serious misuse, and how often are these used?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So the short answer is no, we don't have any legal powers in terms of, being able to fine people or anything like that. We always kind of describe our powers as quite soft powers. So a lot of the positive outcomes that we get are by building good relationships with other government departments, getting them on board for working with us. I mentioned earlier we have our code of practice for statistics, and that is a standard that we can hold government to, including ministers as well. It's in their code of practice that they have to adhere to our code of practice. So there are frameworks in place, but they're not necessarily legal frameworks. And as I said, a lot of the work and the positive outcomes that we get are from working with other government departments and from a lot of the other regulatory work that we do outside of casework as well.
Fab, thank you, Nikki. The next question is, do you have to wait for someone to raise an issue if a statistic is misrepresented publicly, or can your staff operate proactively if you see a problematic stat?
Yep, so we definitely do both. So I think the first thing to say is that we are quite a small organisation, so there is a somewhat sort of reactive element, but there are definitely two streams. There's the stream where people can raise a concern with us, but we also will proactively kind of raise what we call internal casework as well, where we may have seen something on Twitter in a government press release or something like that. So it is something that we kind of proactively horizon scan for as well.
Great, thank you. We'll now go on to Paul's question. So misuse is not necessarily only by government, but also by other politically active organisations and individuals. How is the misuse monitored?
Yeah, so the core of what OSR is kind of responsible for setting the sort of Statistics Act is the official statistics, so those produced by government, and the kind of centre of that is also then the use of those official statistics by government. And then what I normally think about is kind of concentric rings kind of going out from that, where you've kind of got the government in the middle, and then maybe, you know, you've got like ministers, and then you've got wider parliament, so MPs who are not ministers, and then beyond that you might have like the media and sort of third sector organizations, and kind of with each level you go, our kind of influence decreases a little bit. But that's not to say that we don't get involved in cases outside of government, if it's a particularly kind of case of key public interest or importance. We will get involved if we think there's a positive influence that we can have, or, you know, a sort of positive input that we can put into it. So, you know, if it's a media organization or if it's a charity or things like that. But we are always aware that they're kind of outside of our formal remit, so obviously that our scope is a little bit looser, and it's on a bit more of an informal and advisory basis. But yeah, if we think there's a benefit for us getting involved, we will kind of speak up and get involved in those ones.
Great, thank you, Nikki. I'll go on to the next one, which is, there is so much content put out every day. What is your strategy for keeping up? Do you prioritise social media accounts with a lot of followers, for example? Miles, I think that might be one for you.
Yes, in quite simply, although it's a little bit more to it than that. It's how many responses they get, the impact, how many impressions does a post get as well. Who is it come from? Is it, you know, is it a mainstream news organization? I talked a little bit about, you know, the prominence of the person, you know, if they're an elected official. But yeah, broadly, because we're trying to, as I said, we're trying to assess how much, you know, what is the potential for harm here, before we respond.
Great, thanks, Miles. The next one is, what would you say is the most common causes of misleading use, including both deliberate and accidental?
Who's going to take that?
Yeah.
I don't mind doing it first.
You,
Yeah. I'll jump in first and I'll pass to you, Miles. I would say from my experience of working in this sort of statistics regulation, and this is completely unfounded on any statistics, so don't try and fact check me, personal views. I would say for the vast majority of the misleading use, it is accidental. You know, there are times where people will deliberately use something, and you know, there is a lot of rhetoric at the moment about the kind of age of disinformation and fake news. But I think actually when you look at it in British politics, we are lucky that those cases are few and far between of deliberately misusing a statistic. What we do more commonly see is the accidental misuse, either if you think of the principles of intelligent transparency that Anna outlined, it could be by not providing a source, it could be by not using it kind of quite properly without the right context, or without making the limitations clear, you know, or using it in a slightly different way. And, you know, not everyone is a statistics expert, and that's absolutely fine, but that's why there are frameworks in place within government to support comms and to support ministers when they are using these statistics. So it's just really important that those kind of structures are used appropriately to kind of help reduce that. But yeah, the short answer is mostly accidental, and I think that's a really positive thing.
Yeah, I think so. I would I'd probably add a third area in there as well. I need to put my hand out here and confess to being a former journalist myself. And, you know, of course, the tendency when you're a journalist, you know, you do want to write the strongest possible story that you can possibly extract from the facts. And you know, they who is without sin, let them work for the statistics regulator. It's quite often our job just to you know, point it out to journalists when they've pushed the facts, you know, beyond the load-bearing capacity of the statistic themselves, and it's our job to point that out to them and rein them in. But it's neither deliberate or accidental. It's an understandable desire to you know, get attention, and that actually goes for quite a bit of misinformation as well, I think. Although obviously the motives there can be rather darker than simply, you know, trying to grab a headline.
I would just add as well, Eleanor, we publish a annual report on our casework. So while that doesn't obviously cover all examples of misuse, it does cover everything that is raised with us. And in that report, we break down the concerns that have been raised with us, depending on what type of concern that was. So yeah, you can have a look back at those reports over the years to see sort of how the different types of concerns that have been raised with us about misuse has changed.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Anna. Thank you. And we'll include the link. We'll send that link out to everybody after the event so they can have a look at those. The next one is from Paul. Is the increase in use of AI in how source data is selected by AI a problem or help or work in progress? How would ONS use AI to enable and increase trust? Miles, I might hand that one over to you.
Without wishing to cop out on this, I think it's possibly a little early to say. I know colleagues have been looking at uses of AI. It does offer the fantastic, of course it does. There's so many areas that offers fantastic potential. I know we're looking at the possibilities. As far as concerned, wouldn't it be wonderful to have an all-purpose statistical oracle that you can simply ask and trust to come up with all the relevant verified data on a particular topic? Who's to say that we won't see such a thing in the next couple of years? I can't put it any more strongly than I know this is an area that the ONS is interested in, and our colleagues, particularly in the data science campus, that's the government's data science campus, which ONS hosts, as you'd expect, are looking at very seriously indeed.
I would like to plug our last Bringing Data to Life webinar, which was on artificial intelligence and how the ONS are piloting it. So, Paul, I would recommend you have a look at that recording if you're interested in having a look at how ONS are piloting the use of AI, definitely. We've got a few more minutes left, so I'll just ask a few more questions. The next one is from Andrew. I think this is in reference to your presentation, Nikki. So you say trust in politicians is at the lowest for 40 years. Is that because they were actually lower values then, or because the series only goes back 40 years?
I have fact-checked this, and it's because it's the lowest since the survey began in 1983. So if you Google the Ipsos Veracity Index, you'll be able to find more information on that.
Great, thanks, Nikki. The next question is, are cases only based on inaccuracy, or can it include in-context misrepresentation?
Yeah, so as part of our casework, we'll look at like a whole range of things that are raised with us. And inaccuracy is definitely one issue, but as you saw in the intelligent transparency principles, it can also include that sort of, is it supporting understanding? Has it been used in the right way? And we have also done quite a lot of work on misleadingness as well. And we've done a lot of kind of philosophical thinking, working with actual philosophers in universities. So, what does something misleading actually mean? And we have quite a lengthy, wordy definition of it, which I won't repeat, but the basic premises of it is that something could lead someone to concluding something different than maybe what the data shows, regardless of whether the data is correct. Because what we see sometimes, like with that Treasury graph, the figures are presented there were actually correct. The Treasury didn't make an error, but it's definitely the context and the misrepresentation. So I think often the cases that we get are kind of slightly more in that grey area, which, can make it requires a lot more nuance kind of navigating through as a regulator, rather than being able to come out and say, this is absolutely wrong, you shouldn't have done this. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. I think we'll have our final question before we wrap up. So this is from Andrew. To what extent do you feel media initiatives such as BBC Verify are helpful and support intelligent transparency?
So I think the simple answer is very important. So we don't work that closely with BBC Verify, but we do work quite closely with Full Fact, who do kind of fill that fact-checking role quite closely. And often if there are cases that we've spotted that it wouldn't be within our remit to handle, we'll kind of flag it to them as well. So between us, we're kind of covering slightly different angles. And I think we saw during the election how important BBC Verify was, especially, and also Full Fact as well. Our scope is somewhat kind of narrow in terms of the official statistics and used by government. So being able to have organisations such as BBC and Full Fact who can do these much broader kind of look across, they're able to kind of comment often more timely and kind of maybe in a slightly different way, have a slightly different lens than we would. So yeah, I think they're incredibly important, and they also help have different angles kind of pushing forward the intelligent transparency, and Full Facts are huge supporters of intelligent transparency as well, have publicly supported it several times. So yeah, very important, and we try and make sure that we're kind of using those connections as best as possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you, Nikki.
I'd
Sorry,
say as
Lyle.
well. Also, those organisations hold us to account as well, as much as anybody else. They can challenge us most robustly when occasion demands, and we make us justify our position on numerous things.
Thank you very much for answering those questions. I think that's all we've got time for today. So I'll just do a little wrap up to end. So thank you very much for those attending today. Thank you to our speakers, Miles, Nikki and Anna. Great presentations. Of course, you can attend more events in the series or other ONS events on Eventbrite. And as we've all mentioned today, you can follow official statistics producers on a range of social media, including LinkedIn, Instagram and X, or whatever platforms you use. You can also respond to our consultations and engagement questionnaires, where we really value your feedback. And also you can respond to surveys if you are selected. Finally, we would just
please do
like
respond to surveys.
Yes, please do. Finally, we would like you to complete our feedback form today, which is just gathering a few insights into how you find the webinar series, if you have any feedback for us. But thank you for everyone attending today, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.